Thank you. I will try and make sure, after that lovely lunch, I try and keep you all awake. Okay. I'm going to try and explain one of what Mark described as one of the subsystems of corruption and the significance I think it has in explaining how, in keeping with the theme of our conference, the concept of corruption was politicized. But politicized not through discourse surrounding the central political institutions, but instead around, obviously, something that was a political institution, but one with a much wider remit, which was, of course, the established church. If you read accounts of church abuse by modern historians of the pre-Victorian church, interestingly, they always avoid the word corruption. It's very interesting that they avoid it. You can usually find a pattern. There are outrageous cases of misappropriation of resources, enrichment of individual clergy, the uniquely Anglican problem of non-residence of clergy and pluralism, all of which are illustrated in this alphabet of misbehaviour. Most historians of the church, such as Arthur Burns and Francis Knight, say that these were greatly exaggerated, and that actually, when the Ecclesiastical Revenues Commission met in 1835, it was far less problematic than that which its critics painted. Now, to those of us who study corruption, of course, the willingness to overlook the unethical and to emphasise the service of the common good is a fairly common practice, isn't it? That's what defenders of corrupt institutions tend to do. Oh, it's not as bad as you're suggesting. The problem is, of course, is that most of the defenders of the church tend to place all the church's accusers together. People like William Hone, who, as you can see here, places the clergy as one of the vermin in the state, or as clerical showmen there. People like Richard Carlile, people like William Cobbett, William Benbow, Robert Taylor, were all outspoken atheists. But equally speaking, there were people like John Ashford Wise, clergymen like Thomas Sims, Sidney Smith, Williams Watt Wilkinson, and lawyers like Robert Henley, who wrote the 1832 Plan of Church Reform on which the Ecclesiastical Commission was eventually based. And if you look at the work of John Wade, who of course I've studied, the problem is that Wade does both. On the one hand, he can be very outspoken, but on the other hand, he can be far more practical and analytical. Now, Edward Berens, writing in 1828, warned that if the church didn't respond to the criticisms that have been taking place for the last 40 years, the public would turn against it. And if you think about it, from Watson's letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1783 to Jeremy Bentham's Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, even to the more vulgar, if entertaining, periodicals such as the Church Examiner, showing Mistress Virago feeding bishops from her breasts, and piglets, as you can see down there, feeding in a similar fashion. It's not a very flattering comparison, is it, between the church and the pig? Or here, the arms of the church, overseen by a wolf with the bishop's mitre, the devil and a fool. Unsurprisingly, this kind of tradition, if you add it to the longer standing tradition, cartoons like Thomas Rowlandson, showing the tithe pig being donated to the fat clergyman with the gouty leg, Robert Dighton, the difference between the poor curate and the fat rector, George Cruikshank, showing not only the fat clergyman fighting over the loaves and fishes, but also the fat clergyman worshipping the golden calf in the background, and even Robert Seymour's wonderful image of the March of Progress, with, as you can see here, a couple of clergymen trying to fight to hang on to their rectorships underneath. You can see the trope of the clergyman as the epitome of the corrupt state was well established by 1828. So much so that writing The Christian Socialist nearly 50 years later, John James Beezer recalled that reading his employer's radical literature in 1832 had taught him, and this is a quote, both by oral and written tradition, that to be a bishop you must be a fat man. That was the conclusion he reached. And the problem was the church did nothing to counter these axioms. But, although this may simply be seen as abusive, I would argue that it was actually this publication, John Wade's Black Book, or Corruption Unmasked, first published in 1820, regularly updated and retitled until 1835, that rendered the extent of the abuses of the church a matter of public and thereby political concern. It tends to be put alongside other church literature, and the title for my paper is taken from one of Wade's more extreme outbursts. He describes the church as an ulcerous concretion, a foul and unreformed mass of rapacity, intolerance, and absurdity, ostentatiously formed on the doctrines of Jesus, but no more to do with his doctrines than the Creed of Mohammed or the maxims of Confucius. But, as you can see here, it also contained detailed facts and figures about the actual existence of non-residents, the sheer number of clergymen who didn't live locally, and the sheer amount of money that the Church of England was actually costing the state at this point. In his 1831 extraordinary Black Book, he moved it from a later chapter to, as you can see here, the first chapter. And look, the first 150 pages of the Black Book are just about the church. No longer, of course, as we were saying, is this the Prince Regent who's the target. It's now the clergy itself. And he did say, and he was very clear about, thinking of what Mark told us earlier, about not criticising the church as a whole. He said himself, in this edition, to the Church of England in the abstract, we have no objection to offer. We're sorry to see her spiritual functions superseded by any other sect. But as far as I can tell, Wade's work is the first significant modern British political text to describe corruption in a form of the failure of appointed public servants to fulfil their civic duty, or trust, as holders of public office. And he actually uses the language of public utility. At one point he describes the clergy's failure as this: the inefficiency of the clergy as public teachers, the hurtful influence they have on our national affairs, their inertness in the promotion of measures of utility, he uses the word utility, that induce men to begrudge themselves the immense revenue expended in their support. Now, often, of course, as I say, many people have ridiculed Wade's figures as being inaccurate. Though, of course, I would point out it's quite hard to get accurate figures of a corrupt institution, but tends to stand to reason. They don't tend to publish these. But a historian of the church, writing in the 1930s, put it rather neatly like this: the historical importance of the Black Book has little to do with the question of its reliability. Its importance lies in the success with which it focused attention on the abuses of the time, making it impossible for the intelligent Englishman to overlook. And I would argue that it's that expose that led to a less moral, less theological definition of corruption, and was, in effect, the most successful example of what is now the accepted definition of corruption: the misuse of public office or public trust. But just for the benefit of the rest of this paper, rather than just focusing on Wade, I want to just mention the particularly effective target, demonstrating that the critique of corruption was not just about institutions as a whole or systems. It was about particular people within those institutions and systems who misused them. In this case, the target was Durham. Durham was the wealthiest diocese in England. Its income was twice that of London, even though it had half the population. It was notorious already because they refused to ring the bells to mark the death of the radical hero Queen Caroline in 1821. And an article had been published in the Durham Chronicle, which was run by the son-in-law of the Whig leader Earl Grey, which described them as beetles at war with the spirit of the age. Well, stupidly, the chapter then sued the newspaper, so there was a trial. And of course, you need a trial, don't you, to have a public platform. And in this platform, Henry Broome, who was, of course, the man who defended the Queen at the debate in the House of Commons, He came, and although he did nothing, he couldn't save Williams, because Williams had published this libel. He made a point, as you can see here, of repeating the word vermin to describe the church. Of course, this set a tone. The Edinburgh Review criticised the golden stalls of Durham. And the attacks continued. In 1831, the same year as the extraordinary Black Book came out, they published this article on New Year's Day, criticising the way in which patronage had become completely unacceptable. And it's a very similar tone to that of the Black Book. It makes a point of criticising in particular those people who hold more than one parish, describing them as only considering how they might fleece the flock and increase their income. The injury they do to religion is incalculable. It then picked on individuals. It was prepared to name individuals. In this case, it picked on a very interesting individual, not the bishop himself, but in this case, they built on they took the example of the sorry, I'm just checking this paper. Oh, there we go. They took the younger brother of the Duke of Wellington. The younger brother of the Duke of Wellington, as you can see here, was found to have no fewer than 5 parishes and earned an income of, so it was claimed in the newspaper, of £4,000. Now that might seem again like another radical exaggeration. I've read the Ecclesiastical Commission report. He actually earned £5,170 a year, and he lived in the south of France. He had permission to live in the south of France. So as you can see here, the criticism was well aimed, and the church had no defence, so it put forward no defence. And despite all the criticism, the bishops at Durham were prepared to defend their cause completely. Van Mildert, the bishop, actually voted against the Second Reform Act. And by voting against the Second Reform Act, even the Times newspaper came out against the bishops, producing this article in which it claimed that the bishops were an exhibition of perverseness. Such was the anger against the bishops. Notice it's the 10th of October. We don't have many genuinely unique English celebrations in our country. Everything is usually some other European celebration that we've perverted. But we do have one, and of course it's Guy Fawkes Night. So on Guy Fawkes Night, having identified the bishops as the enemy, here's an article I found in the National Archives. Here's a cartoon from the satirist. 199 were the members of Lords who voted against the Second Reform Act. You might see the number is in front of the gates of hell there as well. On the 5th of November 1831, they didn't burn an effigy of Guy Fawkes. They burnt an effigy of the bishop. 21 different effigies of 21 different bishops were burnt across, outside the gates of the parish close, the cathedral close, across Britain. Now, interestingly, I've actually looked at the Royal Commission into Inquiry into Church Revenues that was established by Grey's government shortly before the actual Ecclesiastical Commission itself. And it's found that 3 churches had large populations and no church. One village had 36 people and no church, yet the dean and chapters in all these cases got revenue for these parishes. So effectively the revenue was going straight to the cathedral, not to service the public. It seems eventually that the church, when it was attacked by Wade directly in the second edition of the Black Book, that the church came to its senses. Van Mildert set up a fund to fund curacies, and they decided, like any institution that knows that the inspectors are coming around, well, what do you do if the inspectors are coming to visit? You have all this money that you can't account for, that you've got. Well, you need to launder it, don't you? So, yes, Durham University was founded. That's what Durham University, that's where the money went. Of course, Durham University was the last university to allow non-Anglicans to attend. Van Mildert personally ordered that no non-Anglican should attend Durham University. Van Mildert still voted against the third Reform Bill, and the Times described him as that pious soul Van Mildert, with much his money bags bewildered. It's a terrible rhyme, but it's a good one. Obviously, the radicals still didn't believe this. They still didn't, believe that this was anything more than token reform. Here you can see Mistress Virago being carried across the swamp by figures like Peel and the Duke of Wellington, but she's still with her money bags preserved at the same time. Van Mildert died, though, in March 1836, and his successor, Edward Maltby, had voted for the Second Reform Bill, and he accepted that change had to come. Money was taken from the former bishop's protégés, which included the children of his sister-in-law, who'd been promoted, and money was ensured that all parishes got an income of at least £200. But the Ecclesiastical Commission soon took over things. 6 of the 12 stalls at Durham Cathedral were abolished, and most of the money was handed over to the new diocese in Manchester and Ripon. Ripon, of course, serving West Yorkshire, and there's woolen mills, Manchester serving the cotton mills of Lancashire. I think, to be honest, Blomfield, the Bishop of London and the head of the Ecclesiastical Commission, was making an example of Durham, to try and convince people that the church had changed. And of course it had. 290 of the non-resident prebends and 103 of the residents who did no work but got a salary were removed. Pluralism was effectively abolished by 1845. There was one clergyman to every 1.06 parishes. But, I'll finish with this as an idea, whether or not these went far enough in terms of actually introducing what I have used as an analysis tool of what I call the ethos of public service into England, after such a long period of corruption and abuse, is more debatable. Let's be honest, the tithes continued to keep Anglican rectors on the same social footing as the gentry, as you can see from this cartoon here, at least until the collapse of English agriculture in the 1880s. If a bishop or dean or archdeacon attempted to discipline idle or indolent or incompetent clergymen, these were usually unsuccessful. All those people who lost their positions still retained their salaries until they died. Maltby, who reformed Durham, was allowed to earn, under the new laws, up to £8,000. In 1841, it was revealed that his salary was actually £21,000. So bishops were still doing very well. His successor, Bishop Villiers, was exposed in 1860, having appointed his 18-year-old son-in-law, Edward Cheese, to a rich parish at the expense of much more experienced clergymen. Fundamentally, the Church of England remained as powerful throughout the Victorian era as it had ever done, controlling entry, as this cartoon points out, to the Universities of Oxford, Cambridge and Durham until 1854, 1856 and 1865 respectively, which of course meant they controlled entry to the professions and entry to the civil service. Members of the Church of England continued to receive preferential treatment at disproportionate number of public schools and Oxbridge and Durham colleges long after this. And the networks of association the membership of the Church of England provided in educational, royal, club and parliamentary circles still ensured advancement for the well-connected Anglican. So my conclusion is, this shows Mr. Punch bringing the dirty laundry of the church to be washed, and of course the clergymen aren't interested. They've got their own pet issues, in this case the missions to the colonies. They're not interested in washing the church's dirty laundry. As with most corrupt institutions, the church was incapable of reforming itself. The perversion of its original purposes had become endemic, and that's what Wade exposed. The work of any virtuous clergyman was negated by structures and by systems which favoured the idle, the greedy and the rapacious. What was needed was an external body backed by executive authority and made up of those committed to the principles of public service and moral regeneration. Sadly, it got the Ecclesiastical Commission. And what was the Ecclesiastical Commission made up of? Unreformed, if less corrupt, bishops and members of the Conservative Party who wished primarily to reduce public anger with the Church rather than increase the quality of the Church's ethical practices and public service. So it might, looking from the outside, to quote von Rothstein, look like the Church of England underwent a big bang of reform in the 1830s and 1840s, which drove out corruption. But, and this is true of so many different institutions that I'm writing about in my current book, one must not mistake the ending of excessive abuses with the creation of a public-facing, ethically trained, universalist, impartial and meritocratic body subject to open competition for appointment, promotion and reward. I don't think even the Church of England's most fervent defenders could possibly claim that the Anglican Church had achieved that during the 19th century. Thank you very much.